Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give it one more minute to allow as many people to get in to the webinar. Thank you for your patience. Hello, everyone. A very good morning to you all. Thank you for joining this webinar as part of the VBA's Practitioner Education Series. I'm Shobini Mahendra, your host for today. I'm the Chief Analyst at the Victorian Building Authority. Please note that we are running a hybrid webinar today that includes streaming of learning content with interactive polls and live Q&As answered by our team. I encourage you to participate in the interactive polls and also to type your questions into the Q&A chat function at the bottom of your screens during the webinar. Today's webinar on management of condensation and mold growth risk draws on insights from research conducted by Dr. Mark Dewsbury from the University of Tasmania through a grant supported by the Victorian Building Authority. The research and this webinar are part of the VBA's multifaceted approach to tackling water ingress and harms in built environment. This is a key regulatory priority for the VBA. Today's webinar provides a holistic approach to understanding and managing condensation and mold growth risk in Victorian homes. The webinar is intended for a wide audience, including building designers, architects, builders, building surveyors, plumbers, engineers, trades, academics, and students. We hope you gain real benefit from today's webinar. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples attending the session today. Today, you'll be hearing from Dr. Mark Dewsbury, a senior lecturer at the University of Tasmania, on understanding and managing condensation and mold growth risk, how to apply mitigation measures in the National Construction Code, and practical tips to reduce these risks. Dr. Mark Dewsbury teaches building science, building information modelling, and design streams at the School of Architecture and Design at the University of Tasmania. His research focuses on improving construction, thermal performance, energy use, indoor environmental quality, and condensation risk analysis in Australian buildings. Mark is the lead researcher in a recently completed research by the University of Tasmania on assessment of mold growth risk in regulatory compliant new homes in Victoria. The research was funded by a Victorian Building Authority research grant in collaboration with the Fraunhofer Institute of Building Physics, Germany, Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation Australia, or the CSIRO, Master Builders Victoria, and Forest Wood and Woods Products Victoria, Australia. As Victoria's building and plumbing regulator, the VBA is committed to ensuring a safe and confident and thriving industry and collaborates with stakeholders to enhance practitioner competence to protect consumers. We have a role in ensuring practitioners understand how to do things correctly so as to maintain the integrity of the building and plumbing industries. We provide general advice about applying the building and plumbing standards and the regulation of building and plumbing work. We publish material to assist carrying out of the functions under the Building Act, and the relevant regulations where regulations are unclear or ambiguous. The VBA scope covers guidance and interpretation of the Building Act, building and plumbing regulations, National Construction Code, and Australian standards. Now, before we begin, I'd like to let you know that this session is being recorded, and the link to this presentation will be made on the VBA's website, along with our previous webinars. If time permits, we will be answering some of your pre-submitted questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Please also submit your questions via the Q&A chat function during the webinar. We will try to answer these questions in the chat function during the webinar. Also, during the webinar, we will be conducting live interactive polls that will automatically appear on your screens. Please participate in these. Links to other relevant websites will appear on some slides as a QR code. Please feel free to scan the QR code on your phone when these appear on the slides to direct you to the relevant websites relating to the topic presented today. We will do our best to answer as many of your questions as we can during the webinar. However, we receive a large volume of questions, and we may not have time to answer your questions during the webinar. After the webinar, we will collate all the unanswered questions and will provide an answer to as many of these as possible. A copy of the questions and answers will be sent out in the weeks following the webinar. So the purpose of this webinar is intended to help you better understand why and how condensation and mould occurs in Victorian homes. The webinar will also give you a broader understanding of the measures in the National Construction Code and practical tips to mitigate the risk of condensation and mould growth and improve the health and safety of building occupants. After this webinar, you should be able to understand condensation and how this occurs, understand how condensation contributes to the risk of mould growth and why mitigation is important, understand how and why the National Construction Code 2022 condensation provisions help mitigate mould growth risk, identify the mitigation measures that research has found effective in reducing mould growth risk in external walls, and understand how these measures relate to proposed changes in the National Construction Code 2025, and explain to consumers and clients practical measures to maintain their homes to minimize condensation and mould growth risk. Now, please sit back and enjoy the webinar. Mark, I'll now hand over to you.
Thank you, Shabini, for that wonderful introduction. So for context, good morning, everyone. Whether it be insulation, air tightness, weather tightness, or ventilation, nothing much has changed in Australian housing until about 2007. Since then, we've hit the crossroads of well-insulated homes with increasing air tightness, but with a lack of interior generated water vapour control and 1800s principles for ventilation. When it comes to NATHERS, or the Nationwide House Energy Rating Scheme, and energy efficiency, we know that these two things are intrinsically linked to human thermal comfort. 2/3 of how we experience the environment is the temperature of the surfaces around us, the floor, the walls, the windows, the doors, and ceiling. We need to condition those surfaces to within our thermal comfort expectations using the least amount of fossil fuel-derived energy possible. But we also need to consider how we protect our building during construction. We've used weather-resistive pliable membranes for decades to protect the structure whilst under construction and after completion. This stops the wind and moisture from progressing into the insulation layer. We also need to ensure that the cladding doesn't touch the weather-resistive pliable membrane, as between 1% and 7% of the wind-blown moisture that reaches the interior side of the cladding systems. We've also known for more than 50 years that these materials need to consider water vapour diffusion. We all know about insulation. This should be installed hard against the floor, walls and ceilings with no gaps to minimise the energy needed to condition those surfaces. Importantly, our glazed windows and doors are also critical components of our insulation. Airtightness and solar control systems. A common problem with many high-efficiency homes is overheating due to a lack of solar control. Airtightness is critical in all climates, as it reduces the thermal comfort impacts on cold and hot drafts into the home. Within the NCC, or the National Construction Code, closely fitted plasterboard, skirting boards and cornices are our principal actions for airtightness. When a house is new, this may be a good process, but as a house ages and the structure shudders under the force of many storms, small gaps appear, making the home less airtight and allowing lots of water vapour into external walls. Since 2016, the National Construction Code expects all homes to have a maximum air leakiness of 10 air changes per hour when a 50 Pascal pressure difference is applied. A 50 Pascal pressure difference equates to a 32 kilometre breeze. This would mean that when a breeze of 32 kilometres is blowing, the air in the house changes 10 times in 1 hour. When a breeze is not blowing, the air change rate could be as low as 0.5 air changes per hour. So subject to the outside wind speed, the conditioned air in the home changes somewhere between 0.5 and 10 times every hour. This table shows the results from the CSIRO's latest air tightness study. For Victoria, it shows that the air tightness of apartments and homes when a 50 Pascal pressure difference is applied ranges from 0.79 to 17.46. Anything under 5 should have a balanced mechanical ventilation system to provide fresh air into the home. Everything over 10 doesn't meet the expectations of the community or the building regulations. And since the 1980s, international experience has shown that anything under 8 air changes at N50 should have hydrothermal design considerations for the floor, roof, and external wall systems. Now, really importantly, ventilation is not air tightness. In Australia, we've never had a culture of ventilation. Our historically leaky homes did all the ventilation for us. Within the building regulations, to avoid the need for mechanical ventilation, every habitable room needs access or borrowed access to an operable window. And these windows need to be open every day to ensure that we are getting at least 0.25 air changes per hour in every room. But how does this relate to urban living or modern living? That the hours spent at work or the hours, but how does this relate to urban living? The hours spent at work or the outside air temperature? This graph shows the average hourly temperatures for Melbourne. The light blue section is when the outdoor air temperature is above 20 degrees Celsius. The dark blue section is when the outdoor air temperature is less than 20 degrees Celsius. If we are trying to heat a home, why would we also open windows in every habitable room to ensure we have the required 0.25 air changes per hour? This highlights a misalignment in the regulations. Which brings us to condensation. Condensation. Think of going to a club or a bar and asking for a cold drink. As the bartender fills the glass, condensation forms. But a few minutes later, the glass is dry. In the first instance, the coolness of the drink forces the air around the glass to condense on the cold glass. But as the drink warms, the condensation returns to the air as water vapour. This process happens every day in our backyards, subfloor spaces, roof spaces, and exterior wall systems, and on single glazed windows. Hygrothermal research, or hygrothermics, is a study of the interactions of heat, water vapour, and construction materials. This slide shows a simplified formula to calculate when condensation will occur. If our living room is 20 to 22 degrees Celsius and our interior relative humidity is 80%, the dew point temperature, or temperature at which condensation occurs, would be 18 degrees Celsius. That indicates that any surface that is 18 degrees Celsius will support condensation. If we manage the interior relative humidity to a maximum of 65%, we can reduce the dew point temperature to 15 degrees Celsius. What we haven't mentioned yet is the 10 to 14 kilograms of water vapour a family of four generates each day. This is not the liquid water from bathroom, kitchen and laundry activities. This is purely water vapour. As we keep adding more and more water vapour, we need to remove it from the building interior. Otherwise, surface and interstitial condensation and mould can occur. We generally have two methods to remove occupant-generated water vapour in temperate climates, namely mass air transfer, or more commonly known as ventilation, and water vapour diffusion. As the interior relative humidity increases, many materials in our home adsorb water vapour. Conversely, when the interior relative humidity decreases, many materials give water vapour back into the room. Technically, we call this hygrothermal buffering. This highlights that we can't stop condensation from occurring, but we need to manage interior generated water vapour, minimise thermal bridges, and design subfloor zones, roof spaces, and exterior wall systems to maximise drying potential. So how might we manage condensation? When we think about heating, we need to fully separate hot and cold elements. In terms of moisture, control the amount of water vapour in the air and control where and how water vapour moves. We now have a short quiz. Can you stop condensation from happening in homes? Yes or no? And what causes condensation in homes? Now that you have finished the quiz, the answer to question 1 is no, that we cannot stop condensation happening in homes. And the answer to question 2 is all of the above. Our cooking, showering, breathing and drying clothes all contribute to condensation in homes. This now brings us to mould. When we don't adequately control interior generated water vapour, condensation becomes very apparent very quickly. Here we can see images on the left with condensation and mould in a roof space, and images on the right with condensation and mould on single glazed windows. All of these images are from homes that were less than 6 months old. Historically, Australians seem to have a love affair with mouldy homes. But since 2009, the World Health Organization has stated that no home or workplace should have a visible presence of mould. We can do a quick internet search and find a plethora of articles from very sick building occupants that have resulted from surface and interstitial mould in buildings. Mould spores create an allergic reaction that are so small that when we breathe them in, They travel through our lungs and straight into our bloodstream. Our body's immune system then kicks in to fight this contagion. Until 2019, Australia was one of the few developed nations that did not have any condensation or mould related building regulations. And we have had twice the asthma rate of many OECD nations. So the NCC, or the National Construction Code and Condensation. As mentioned earlier, since 2019, the National Construction Code has included some clauses regarding condensation in Class 1 and Class 2 residential buildings. Even though there has been lots of science since the 1930s, Australia's first national action was in 2016, a survey of design and construction professionals, which identified that up to 40% of buildings constructed in the previous decade had a concerning presence of condensation or mould. In 2019, the NCC required the use of a Class 3 water vapour permeable, weather resistive pliable membrane in climate zones 6, 7 and 8. In 2022, this was increased to a Class 4 water vapour permeable membrane in climate zones 6, 7 and 8, and added a requirement for a Class 3 water vapour permeable pliable membrane for climate zones 4 and 5. But is this enough? The University of Tasmania research and the research conducted by the University of Wollongong suggest that it may not be enough. To partly address this gap, the draft version of the 2025 NCC has added requirements for all climate zones and is likely to include a ventilated and drained cavity for all cladding systems. As mould spores affect human health, the other significant change for the 2022 National Construction Code was the shift from focusing on condensation to focusing on mould. This graph illustrates what we know about mould growth. Mould needs water vapour, temperatures above 5 degrees Celsius, and food. The blue line shows 100% relative humidity, or when condensation occurs, and this was the focus of the NCC 2019. The red line shows 70% relative humidity when mould will grow in a well-ventilated space, and is the focus of NCC 2022. The yellow line shows a 60% relative humidity when mould will grow in poorly ventilated spaces, like the interstitial subfloor, roof spaces, and external wall systems, and on poorly ventilated surfaces around the home. The 2022 NCC listed a new verification method that stipulates that an external wall system should not have a mould index that exceeds 3. Mould is all around us right now in its microscopic form, but it is invisible. When we change the conditions, its rate of growth increases and it can become visible. Overlapping the World Health Organization's recommendations, a mould index of 3 is when the mould becomes optically visible, or we can see it with the naked eye. To help address some of these issues, the 2022 NCC added enhanced requirements for interior and roof space ventilation. These actions are good, but for a house interior, the extra extraction ventilation described for bathrooms and kitchens is still relying on a leaky home or windows being left open in all rooms. As mentioned a few slides ago, there have been increases in the water vapor diffusion properties of exterior weather-resistive pliable membranes. Australian Standard 4200.1 describes the physical properties for pliable membranes that we may place on our exterior and interior walls and within our roof spaces. This slide shows a table from the Australian Standard, which shows the range of water vapour permeance values attributed to the 4 classes. A higher water vapour permeance value indicates that more water vapour can diffuse through the product. But all products that are used on the exterior of a timber or steel frame dwelling must also address weather resistance, water resistance, and air tightness. Now it's time for our second quiz. Can mould grow when the relative humidity, RH, is less than 70%, but more than 60%? And the second question, what is the maximum mould index allowed by NCC 2022 verification method? The answer to these quizzes, so question 3, can mould grow when the relative humidity is less than 70%, but more than 60%? The answer is yes. And the answer for question 4 is when the mould index is not greater than 3. So this brings us to our research and our research insights. The University of Tasmania, in collaboration with the CSIRO, Master Builders Victoria and the Fraunhofer Institute of Building Physics and Forest Wood Products Australia, obtained a research grant from the VMIA to further explore what may be needed to address moisture and mould risks in modern energy-efficient low-rise, timber-framed external wall systems constructed in Victoria. This short movie shows the flow of heat and moisture through an external wall system over a period of 10 years. The exterior is on the left side and the interior is on the right. The top red section shows the temperature. The green section shows relative humidity, and the blue line at the bottom shows moisture. Please note how much time the green line is above 60% relative humidity and where this occurs within the wall system. What we can observe is that it's quite often above 60% and very often above 80% out on the inside surface of the pliable membrane or the weather resistive layer that wraps our building. The results from the heat and moisture calculations are then processed via a mould growth calculation method to produce a mould index graph. The x-axis is showing years, and the y-axis is showing the calculated mould index. The example graph here is showing the downward trend in summer when the wall system is too dry, and the upward trend in the cooler months when the materials in the wall are too moist. We can see that the mould index of 3 is reached by year 5. The research identified that in most cases there was no liquid moisture accumulation, that non-equatorial facing southern walls or shaded walls in other orientations demonstrated the greatest potential risk, enhancing the water vapor permeability of the exterior weather resistive layer, combined with a ventilated and drained cavity between the cladding system and the weather resistive layer, and adding an interior vapor control layer provide the most robust outcomes. This graph shows a summary of the research results for NCC climate zones 6 and 7, with an air change rate at N50 of 10. The 2022 NCC requirements, which do not include a vented and drained cavity, show that 47% of the simulated external wall systems had a mould index greater than 3. When the proposed requirement for a vented and drained cavity is added, the number of external wall systems with a simulated mould index of more than 3 reduces to 31%. NCC Climate Zone 4 is more challenging. This graph shows a summary of the research results for NCC Climate Zone 4 when the air change rate at N50 is 10. And we add a vented and drained cavity, and when we increase the water vapor diffusion properties of the weather-resistive pliable membrane. The 2022 NCC requirements show that 57% of the simulated external wall systems had a mould index greater than 3. When a vented and drained cavity is added, the number of external wall systems with a simulated mould index greater than 3 increases to 67%. When the vapor permeance of the weather-resistive pliable membrane is further increased, the number of simulated external wall systems with a mould index greater than 3 reduces to 43%. This is where we need to be careful. The simulations are imagining a perfect wall. Future research needs to explore the impact of the 1% to 7% of the wind-driven moisture reaching the weather-resistive layer when there is no cavity between the cladding system and the weather-resistive pliable membrane. This slide shows the evolution of the brick veneer exterior wall from 1927 until NCC 2022, which now requires a Class 4 vapor film membrane on the exterior side of the insulation in climate zones 6, 7, and 8. This slide shows the next evolution of the brick veneer external wall system, which could include an interior vapor control layer and the addition of exterior rigid insulation. These same principles apply to other forms of clad timber or steel framed exterior wall systems, where we have evolved to insulated walls with an exterior vapor control layer, but to date there is no requirement for a vented and drained cavity. Looking ahead, we should be adding a vented and drained cavity, which could be teamed with an interior vapor control membrane and an exterior rigid insulation. Some practical tips. Ensure you are complying with the minimum requirements as prescribed in the National Construction Code. Remember, the code is the minimum standard and not best practice. Ensure the detailing adequately addresses well-known points of moisture ingress. Ensure the products you use are appropriately tested and certified. The table in the top right corner is a snapshot from Australian Standard 4200.1 2017 and shows the numeric water vapor diffusion properties for water vapor permeance of pliable membranes. Example 1 shows an inappropriate values for a different system. Example 2 shows an appropriate value that lists the rate of water vapor permeance as 2.983, which exceeds the minimum amount prescribed in the standard of 1.1403. Example 3 shows a more comprehensive label that lists compliance with the Australian standard, is a Class 4 pliable membrane and has a water vapor permeance rate of 2.179, which exceeds the minimum amount prescribed in the Australian standard. Even though not required in the NCC, for external wall systems, consider adding a vented and drained cavity between the cladding system and the weather-resistive pliable membrane, increasing the water vapor permeance of the weather-resistive pliable membrane, and adding an interior vapor control membrane. For mass air transfer, consider adding background ventilation. During construction, try to keep all materials dry and to ensure mold growth is minimized during the construction process. Explore resources provided by government, industry, and community organisations that discuss what is needed to be considered in modern energy-efficient homes to minimise moisture and mould. If we are doing activities that add extra water vapor to the home, open windows or ensure you have a balanced ventilation system that removes excess water vapor. In bathrooms and kitchens, make sure you use an extraction system with the window open or explore a balanced ventilation system. This brings us to our next quiz. Increasing the vapor permeability of an external membrane may lower mould risk of an external wall system. And question 6, what should you avoid while doing laundry to prevent condensation? So the answer to question 5 is true. Increasing the vapor permeability of an external membrane may lower the mould risk of an external wall system. And the answer to question 6 is drying clothes indoors. So what should you avoid while doing laundry to prevent condensation? Avoid drying clothes indoors. This page shows a link with QR codes to other webinars and activities provided by the VBA. Today, we have covered what is condensation and why it occurs, how excess water vapor causes mould growth risk and why it is important to mitigate this risk, how the NCC 22 condensation provisions deal with mould growth risk and further enhancements proposed in 2025, and practical steps you can take to help your clients and consumers manage condensation and minimize the risk of mould growth.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. That was a lot of information, and I hope you've really had a good session today. We've received lots of questions pre-submitted and also some questions in the chat today, which is great to see. And if we haven't already answered your questions, our team is still working through it, or you will receive your answer in the next few weeks, along with a copy of the Q&As from today's webinar. So Mark, let's go on to some of the questions we've received. And Carly, could you take us to question 1, please? I'll just read it out for now while it comes up on screen. So Mark, which one of the solutions that are being raised around this issue, class 4 vapor permeable membranes, ventilated cavities, and roof space ventilation, would have the greatest impact on condensation risk mitigation and improved indoor air quality?
Thanks, Shamina. That's quite a complex question. I guess really we need to think about all 3 zones of the external building envelope. That's the subfloor, the external walls, and the roof space, all need equal consideration. The subfloor zone needs adequate site design for drainage and ventilation to ensure moisture is managed. The roof space zone needs adequate ventilation to remove water vapor that has come from the home and moisture that is condensed on the sarking or roof materials. External walls need to control inward moisture and outward water vapor. To do this, we need a climatically appropriate mix of ventilated and drained cavity between the cladding and the weather resistive layer or the pliable membrane, a vapor permeable weather resistive layer, and in more airtight homes, an interior vapor control membrane, which limits the amount of water vapor that can go into the wall system. Within Australia's temperate climates, we need to ensure that the pliable membrane on the exterior side of the insulation is very vapor permeable. For most climates, our research has shown that when combined with a ventilated and drained cavity, a more vapor permeable membrane provides a better result. That is, as defined in Australian Standard 42.1, a class 4 pliable membrane with a water vapor permeance value greater than 1.14 micrograms per Newton per second or greater. However, in a very humid climate, you may need an AS1400 class 3 vapor membrane to restrict inward water vapor, but still allow water vapor to leave the built fabric. Now, many of our people here aren't from a warm and humid climate, but there might be the odd listener. Finally, to ensure relative humidity is being managed within the home, an enthalpy recovery mechanical ventilation system should also be considered in modern housing. An enthalpy recovery ventilation system uses the outgoing exhaust air to precondition the incoming unconditioned air. These systems ensure the relative humidity, carbon dioxide, and other indoor pollutants are adequately managed in modern homes.
Thank you, Mark. Now, the next question is around the solutions that can improve or could improve ventilation for homes under 8 air changes per hour. What do you have to say about that?
That's another one. And I guess the reason why this number 8 is appearing is that research in America in the 1980s, that's 40 years ago, identified that when we went below 8 air changes per hour, they were doing blower door tests way back then, and improving air tightness of buildings. They showed that when it went below 8, that significant mold and condensation problems started occurring. So they identified then that they need to consider what are the hydrothermal design considerations for new homes and what are the ventilation requirements for new homes. So within that context, there are a few things to consider before we answer this question. We may spend all day at work and all working from home. Who knows? What are the outdoor conditions? Is it noisy? Is it cold? What are our security concerns? And how all of these things can limit our window, like us opening windows. When are we opening windows? How can we open windows? And then do we actually have adequate cross ventilation in the house to actually make the passive ventilation work? If you haven't got cross ventilation, how is the ventilation achieving the expectations of the code? So before I go into other details, there are 2 key points to note. The first point is the difference between diffusion and ventilation. As I mentioned in the slides, a family of 4 can generate 1,800 kilograms, so nearly 2 tons of water vapor during a heating season. But the exterior walls and ceiling may only diffuse 30 kilograms of that. This highlights that ventilation is needed to manage the interior generated water vapor. The second point is that, as I mentioned, the North Americans established in the 1980s that when the air change rate was less than that 8 at ACR N50, that's a 50 Pascal difference, that the hydrothermal design considerations for the building envelope and house ventilation became very important. So getting the building envelope right only addresses half the problem. And similarly, getting the ventilation problem right only addresses half the problem. If we recognize this linkage, we don't want a house full of cold drafts in winter or hot drafts in summer. And we do want better dust control, and for some hay fever sufferers, better pollen control. We need to think a bit differently about building air tightness and ventilation. In the 1970s, and I had an old EJ Holden in the 1980s, but in the 1970s, our car ventilation was managed via windows and other sliding vents. 20 years later, we wanted occupant controlled zonal. We want zone control in our cars for the air temperature and air quality. But how many hours we spend in our cars versus how many hours we spend in the home. Ensuring we're removing excess water vapor and ensuring other indoor pollutants are also addressed via mechanical ventilation can significantly improve indoor air quality and occupant comfort. This can be achieved through the following methods: a balanced mechanical VIST system, such as a heat recovery or enthalpy recovery ventilation system, which provide both supplied exhaust air, exhaust-only systems, which require us to have windows open or a leaky house, or supply-only ventilation systems, which also require us to have open windows to allow for the exhaust to occur. Internationally, the preference for the last 2 decades has been what we call balanced enthalpy recovery ventilation, or heat recovery ventilation in cooler climates, teamed with high efficiency electric split air conditioning systems.
Thank you, Mark. And I know we keep making you talk a lot today, but we did want to have a good fair amount of time for questions. Turning slightly differently to a different aspect, how can builders prevent mold growth on timber frames during construction? At what point do you replace materials rather than dry and clean them?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. This is a common issue raised by many builders. I've received many phone calls from builders on this exact issue. And we have what we call transit-based mold, storage-based mold, and mold during construction. Transit-based mold, it's interesting research that we conducted at the University of Tasmania, and it was published by UTAS in 2023, explored the issues regarding timber damage during transit. This included the temperatures and moisture conditions that timber experiences. One of the findings was the need to use a vapor permeable wrapping system for packs of timber, rather than the standard vapor impermeable plastic wrapping. With this in mind, as soon as a pack of timber arrives on site, it should be moved to a location where it is out of the weather, namely sun and rain, and if wrapped in plastic, have the plastic removed. And I guess in the notes we'll provide to people, there'll be a link to that journal article, the conference paper, sorry, I should say, that was published on that matter. For storage on site, it should be stored in a location where it is out of the weather, namely sun and rain, and not wrapped in plastic. Mold during construction is rare, unless there is a lack of ventilation or excessive rain. Remember, mold grows when the temperature is above 5 degrees Celsius and the relative humidity is above 60%. If timber framing does become excessively wet and enclosed, ensure you allow plenty of ventilation every day such that the timber can dry naturally and mold will revert to its normal microscopic form. As long as we have vapor permeable exterior membranes on our buildings and paper-faced plasterboard, which is also vapor permeable, the timber will naturally dry over time and not support long-term mold growth. An aspect that makes this even more complex is the World Health Organization's statement that no habitable spaces should have a visible presence of mold. But there are some differences between habitable spaces and a house under construction. Habitable spaces are confined spaces with a great opportunity for users to breathe in mold spores. A construction site that is well ventilated will limit opportunities for us to breathe in mold spores and generally lead to mold returning to its microscopic form. If timber shows signs of deep damage or cannot be sufficiently dried or cleaned, and structural integrity is an issue, you may need to consult a building hygienist and/or a structural engineer.
Thank you, Mark. Again, switching a little bit in terms of the focus of our conversation today. Does leaving a house locked up and vacant for several months significantly contribute to mold formation?
Yes, I get many phone calls from people with holiday houses where they've been away for a few months and come back to a house that's wonderfully toxic inside. This is another common one. So yes, leaving a house locked up and vacant, even for 1 month, can significantly contribute. I'll go. Yes. Yes, leaving a house locked up and vacant for even 1 month can significantly contribute to mold formation due to the following factors. The accumulation of dust in a vacant home provides mold spores with an ideal food source, especially in damp environments. A lack of ventilation can support the daily formation of moisture on thermally bridged surfaces like windows, window frames, structural steel elements, and external walls, floors, and ceilings that don't have insulation. And I've been sent many photos of condensation in unoccupied houses. Some rooms in the house will become very warm due to solar radiation, allowing the air to suck in water vapor. But when those same rooms become cold at night and the air is searching for thermal bridges to release moisture, that allows the condensation to occur, and that supports mold growth. If ventilations are not operated on a daily basis, the house will experience fluctuating temperatures, which leads to condensation on windows, walls, and other surfaces, leading to moisture accumulation, which can fuel that mold growth. To prevent mold formation when a home is vacant for several months, consider the following steps. Maintain ventilation by opening windows periodically, whether that's someone coming in on a daily basis, or install timer-activated exhaust fans or a balanced ventilation system. And in some houses, we've been recommended adding solar panels that just, so whenever the sun's up, there's operating fans in the house. So different ways we can get that air moving and removing the moisture from the home. And scheduled periodic inspections to identify potential moisture problems early.
Thank you, Mark. Now, how can mould be minimized or eliminated in existing or older buildings? What's the best treatment for mould in these situations? And we've had a few questions in today's Q&A chat about this type of issue as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's funny when people ring me, I often say, where's mold occurring in your home? And they very rarely say kitchens or bathrooms. And it's interesting because if you think about those rooms, we might spend 10 minutes, maybe half an hour in the bathroom having a shower, and most of that's liquid water that goes down the drain. But we spend many, many hours in our bedrooms at night making water vapor. And so most people ring me complaining about mold growth in bedrooms. So some principles are mentioned in the previous answers in terms of how we think about these things, but a bit of context. I was a teenager in 1970s Western Sydney, and we had a house with no insulation on the floors, walls and ceiling. We often had condensation occurring on the inside surface of the wall at night during winter, for exactly the same reason as why we see condensation forming on single glazed windows today. When we added wall insulation, the condensation still occurs, but now it's occurring inside the external wall. In our old and very leaky houses, with up to 40 air changes per hour, the leakiness did most of the ventilation. Naturally, we wanted to stop the cold and hot drafts and attempt to condition those spaces to more acceptable temperatures. But that warmer air can contain more water vapor, and our draft proofing has stopped water vapor from escaping. I advise many clients regarding the retrofit of older housing to make them more energy efficient, and I always run the gauntlet of better energy efficiency versus poor indoor air quality and mold growth. Long term, or one room at a time, we need to appropriately insulate our exterior walls, floors, and ceilings, such that the condensation occurs in the built fabric and not inside the home. As we enhance these, we need to consider exterior pliable membranes, vented and drain cavities, and interior vapor control options. One option that's become available in Australia is to insulate and manage water vapor diffusion by installing insulation boards that incorporate plasterboard lining on the interior side of external walls. As long as these systems are appropriately taped, top and bottom, they manage water vapor diffusion and improve air tightness and add insulation. We need to address thermal bridges, which lead to ghosting or moisture on some elements. We need to reduce air leakage into the roof space. A single unsealed downlight can allow 1 litre of conditioned air per second into the roof space. Address other aspects of air tightness, but also carefully consider the addition of enthalpy recovery ventilation to minimise heat loss, but provide fresh and low humidity air. Remember, we want to keep the relative humidity below 60% as much as possible. If mechanical ventilation is out of reach, make sure windows are opened a few hours every day, maybe a bit in the morning and a bit in the evening, and ensure no furnishings are creating dead zones. So we don't, beds in corners, lounge chairs in corners, they create dead zones, which are common locations for mold growth. Use dehumidifiers as a last resort. These items use a lot of energy and aren't addressing the root cause of the problem. Ensure we're addressing moisture ingress. Many old houses were not designed to stop moisture ingress around their timber frames. Our old hardwood structures could manage this better than our modern plantation softwood timbers. This is most common around apertures like doors and windows. Don't use cork. I was using cork in the 1990s, but it goes hard over time. You need to remove the trimming elements and use high quality tapes that adhere for more than 50 years. These tapes need to be vapor permeable, but they also stop moisture ingress. And these same tapes can be used on the interior to reduce infiltration and exfiltration. For platform floored housing, ensure the site drainage is removing moisture from around the home and the subfloor area is graded and has above code recommendations for ventilation on all sides. We don't want ventilation in dead spaces in subfloor zones. Matters regarding site drainage and subfloor ventilation are well illustrated in the National Construction Code, which is freely available, and in Australian Standard 2870. Then there is the roof space. If you look at any old building, they're likely to have eave, gable, ridge, and other vents in the roof space. Like the subfloor zone, we have known for millennia that an unconditioned roof space needs good air supply, exhaust, and cross ventilation to keep the materials dry and to remove occupant-generated water vapour. In very old homes, you may need to explore the issue of the damp-proof course and to create a barrier between the ground moisture and the exterior and interior walls. Finally, double glazed windows. With a simple aluminium frame, will still have condensation form on the frame. Please choose window frames with a low conductivity value like timber, UPVC, and thermally broken aluminium which will stop this from occurring. And that's a common phone call. I have many phone calls regarding people saying, I've got new double glazing windows, but I've still got condensation on the frame. Yes, the frame is the thermal breach.
Thank you, Mark. I'm mindful of time. We have maybe one quick last question, and
Yep.
Carly, can you take us to question 7 or 8, I think. Next one. Next one, Carly. The next one after that. I'm just looking at what we can do in another minute. Question 8. Okay, so how can we effectively use different hydrothermal assessments that assign varying material sensitivity classes to the same materials, especially when these assessments are not always aligned with DA07? And maybe you can say what DA07 is.
No, thank you, Sharon. Yes, so in the 2022 National Construction Code, I mentioned a new verification method that talks about what we call hydrothermal simulation. And the verification method mentions the ERA document, DA07, as the simulation method to complete for that verification method. That's a roundabout way of saying it, wasn't it? But so within that, and that's what we call a hydrothermal simulation. So the graphs I showed regarding temperature and heat moving through a wall are from a hydrothermal simulation. So if you're going in that pathway, and I recommend it as a good pathway to take, firstly, the builder or homeowner needs to ascertain the skill level of the person performing the service. I actually just read an email regarding something else, regarding a talk I gave a few years ago regarding the wild west of hydrothermal simulation. So you need to ensure, you need to interview the person. You need to understand that they actually have a good understanding of building physics and that they understand how the software works. Secondly, the climate data selected will have a major impact on the simulation results. And this is a big area of debate in Australia at the moment. The data should include hourly measured values for air temperature, relative humidity, solar radiation, and rain. So, and the important point there is measured. We've identified many climate data sets don't include measured rain. They include satellite-derived rain values, which has a much lower value than the measured rain. Thirdly, the sensitivity of the materials relates to the ability of them to support mold growth. If a wall is made from softwood framing, that sensitivity class should be selected. But wall is made from steel framing, the next most sensitive material being the insulation product should be selected. Additionally, in a steel framed wall, a corrosion assessment also needs to be undertaken because condensation will form on the steel and pool within the steelwork. Thank you, Shamini.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mark Dewsbury, and thank you so much to everyone who's joined us today. We hope you have really benefited from this session. Just as a reminder, we will collate all your unanswered questions and we will answer as many of these as possible in the next few weeks, and we'll send that out to you. We will soon be sending an email that includes the webinar, a webinar survey, and as well as proof of attendance and a link to today's webinar and slideshow. To find out more about the Practitioner Education Series webinars, please visit our website. There's a good one coming up that I'd be very happy to promote on the 24th of October. That's relevant to the topic today as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, we really, really appreciate your attendance today. We hope you have benefited from the session with Mark Dewsbury. And Mark, immense privilege to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for your time and for answering some of the questions at the end.
Thank you, Shalini. Thank you.
Have a wonderful day, everyone.